In this video, I will talk with you a little bit about some of the tools that we're going to be using to create your digital story, and also provide you with a few tips as you begin to think about the ideas that you would want to develop for the project that you're going to create in the Institute. We're calling the project that you're going to be making in this Institute your micro-research project. And we've chosen that adjective, micro-research, on purpose because we do want you to think about the work that you're doing as grounded in the idea of research, but we want you to focus more on the creative elements of the story, on the thinking behind it, and less on the formal aspects of research. But it is important that you think about the project that you're creating as being grounded in the world of research. We're going to define that term quite broadly, and so you can think of research as almost any kind of digging that you would do to inform the work that you're going to be doing. So that's why we're calling it a micro-research project. But in essence, you are creating a short film-like presentation that offers your viewers some information about the topic or question that you have chosen for yourself to explore as you move through the Institute. So let me talk a little bit about some of the details of the project. The topic is your choice. You can pick anything that you are interested to study further and to think about in more detail, but it does need to be related to one of the plays that we're reading, or one or more of the folk and fairy tales that serve as the source materials for the plays. It can be almost any angle in terms of its focus, but the topic does need to somehow relate to the play, so that is one of the parameters of the work. We're also going to offer you three, what I'm calling lenses for the topic, and these are designed to help you think more specifically about the kinds of questions that you would want to ask, and also perhaps the kind of research that you would want to do. But it's also, I'm offering these lenses because I think this might be helpful for you as you think about developing a digital storytelling project similar to the ones that we're making here for the students that you're working with in your classroom. Sometimes it can be helpful for them to have an approach for the work that they're going to be doing. That seems to lessen their anxieties. And so I'm hoping that's what's going to happen here for you as well. Here are the lenses. You may choose to talk about your topic from what we're going to call a personal lens. So in that case, you're going to approach your story with the kinds of questions that scholars who are interested in self-study would ask. So you can begin with anything that interests you personally about the plays or the folk and fairy tales, and your question can be almost anything. And in this case, the frame or the lens that you're going to be using is the frame of personal narrative or personal response. And so you're going to be thinking sort of like a memoirist, creative nonfiction writer, a scholar interested in studying the self, in self-reflection. You may also choose a historical lens, and in that case, you're going to be interested to ask questions that are often asked by historians when they consider a text, and that will help guide the piece that you ultimately write. Or you can choose a performance lens if you're interested in performance work. And in that case, you're going to be approaching the story that you write with questions that might be asked by a performer about interpretation, for example, or a scholar of performance about production values, or about certain kind of directorial decisions that directors have made in creating, or filmmakers and film directors have made in creating performance pieces of the plays. Or maybe it's a combination of those things. So maybe it's a performance lens primarily, but it also has elements of personal narrative. That's fine. But what you're going to do is think about the category that the story that you're writing might fit into, because that category is going to help you think about the kinds of questions that you want to ask yourself as you consider the research. The process needs to involve some formal research, meaning that you're going to be digging and studying, probably using the internet. That's the case for most of the digital humanities. But you can choose, as I said earlier, any research method that interests you or suits your needs. So for example, if you're doing a personal piece, autoethnographic research tools and techniques might be interesting to you. The script is going to be quite short. It's only 300 words or thereabout. And what you're going to do with the script ultimately is you're going to read it as a self-narrated voiceover. That's going to become the soundtrack, essentially, or the recorded narration for your story when you make your digital piece. So that's what you're headed toward, a quite tight script, 300 words. And finally, the format for what you're going to offer to us to look at on our last day of the Institute is going to be an MP4 file. That is a traditional movie file that can be played on almost any program. So that's just a quick introduction. We will be talking much more about the research project as we move through the week together, but I did want to give you an opportunity to think about some of the frames that we have developed for the project. Let's talk a little bit about the tools that we're going to be using. There are lots and lots of tools that can be used for a digital storytelling project. In our case, we're going to look specifically at PowerPoint and Audacity, or those are the ones that I'm going to be talking with you about in our sessions in the Institute. But if you know other tools and you have access to other programs, you are certainly welcome to use those. The kinds of tools used generally for digital storytelling are similar to the kinds of tools that are used in any filmmaking project, and the elements in the process are quite similar of the elements of filmmaking as well. Topic generation, creating a script, thinking about images, sound recording, editing, and then sharing, presenting. However, in educational settings, the kinds of tools that are used are generally less sophisticated, obviously, than the tools that are used by professionals in the film industry. But they do a lot of the same things, so they accomplish a lot of the same goals. The tools that we're using for this institute, PowerPoint in particular, is not sort of a standard tool used for digital storytelling, although it can be used, and you're going to see how that works for us. Some of the other tools like iMovie, for example, which a lot of schools have access to these days, those sort of simple film editing tools are often used in educational settings. But PowerPoint is going to work for us. It will allow us to create the kind of project that ultimately becomes the digital storytelling for this digital story for the Institute. What I've offered here is a flow map of the steps in the process. So I thought it might be helpful to you to have this essentially outline of the steps that we're going to be moving through in our 2 weeks together today on your first day of the Institute. So I'm going to talk through this pretty quickly, but I will put these PowerPoint slides onto the wiki for you, and so you will have access to this flow map later and you can go back and take a look at it. So here's how it works. You're going to pick a topic or choose a question that you want to research or think more deeply about. And then you're going to select one of those lenses that we just talked about, either personal or historical or performance. And this week in particular, you're going to use your journal to be drafting ideas and expanding your thoughts about whatever topic it is that you're creating or thinking more about. And then by the end of the week, you'll be ready to do some research. So maybe over the weekend, that would be something that you might spend a little bit of time doing. You'll do some digging. And you're going to save your sources, of course, just like any researcher would. And then early next week, you're going to create the draft version of your narrative piece, your script. And then we will have a session where you get to share that script with your Institute fellows and get some feedback on it. And then you'll get a chance to revise. And of course, you can be thinking about your visuals and the images that you want to use as we move throughout both weeks of the Institute. But you will have a moment in the work next week where you'll want to pull in or think about the kinds of visual imagery that you would like to offer your viewers. You'll record your narration, which the voiceover, that's you reading your script, and select a soundtrack, some sort of musical accompaniment for the work that you have done on your script, which will help to set the tone. And then mix the voiceover narration and the soundtrack, probably in Audacity. That's the program that I'm going to be talking with you about. If you have some other audio editing program that you like or know how to use, that's perfectly fine. PowerPoint doesn't allow us to do very much editing work, and it certainly doesn't allow us to do any mixing work. And so that kind of editing for the sound needs to be done outside of PowerPoint. But once it's done, it's quite easy to bring in the file and add it to the PowerPoint presentation. And then you'll make your project, probably in PowerPoint, although as I said earlier, if you know something else that you'd like to use, that's fine. You'll share the draft of that in a formal setting for some feedback, and then you'll have some time to revise. And then finally, you will upload your final piece, and on Friday of our second week, we will spend the morning celebrating the good work that you've done. I thought it might be helpful to see a couple of examples of digital stories that students that I've worked with in the past have created. And I've pulled two quite different stories in some aspects, and I will talk just a little bit about what the assignment was for each of these and how the storyteller got to this place. But I pulled things that I thought would maybe be inspirational in some ways, but also would provide examples of some of the things that you might note in terms of what we're able to accomplish with the tools that we're playing with. This first story was created by one of my undergraduate students this past semester, so in the spring of 2021. It was a story created in response to an assignment called the One Image Story, where I asked the students to choose only one image they curated from their own collection of photographs, and they write a story of that image that contextualizes it in some way. And then we go through all the steps that we're going to be going through in this institute together to ultimately create the final piece, but we can only see one image. So the narration and the soundtrack, all of the other kinds of features of the story become extremely important. This piece was made using PowerPoint and Audacity, which are the tools that we're going to be talking about in the Institute. I also thought that this piece, I pulled it because I think you can see how in just a few words, in 300 words, you can convey quite a lot of information. So here's the first piece.
June 23rd, 2017. Journal entry, day 7. I miss the calming sensation of getting into a bed, feeling the sheets' cold fade into a warm and gentle feeling. I envied the shock of cool shampoo against my head and the smell of fruity body wash. We woke up early again this morning. Chrissy and I were in charge of making breakfast. Kat and Angel went and filled our water. Alex mapped out our route for the day, and Jada and Shona took down the tents. We've become more than purely high school friends. We've become a family. The trail has made us a family. Our morning is slow, everyone does their part, and we try to enjoy the time together. The morning is the only time it doesn't rain. We set off 9 a.m. sharp, hoping to set up camp 4:30 p.m. at the latest. The rain was the worst it has ever been. As we began our hike, the rain came crashing through the trees and slamming into the ground. The rain stormed harder with each step I took, devouring the warm and dry clothing I had. My ankles were covered in mud, and I could scarcely see the trail. The dark clouds and towering trees covered any sun or light. We tried to make shelter to rest, but sitting only made us colder. As we continued to hike, without a sign or signal, coming out of the forest onto a massive concrete bridge, the pouring rain halted, and the light in the sky came streaming out of the clouds. I felt a warmth drying my clothing. A joy reaches my face, and an awakening sensation of cold that faded again into heat, that felt just like I was getting into bed.
The second story that I've pulled for you was developed by a high school teacher who participated in a workshop I directed a few years ago called Delving into the Digital Humanities. it was in some ways the precursor to this workshop, because in that workshop the teachers also chose a Shakespeare play to develop a story around, although their frame was different from the frame that we're playing with in Shakespeare digital storytelling. In this workshop, the teachers could choose any play, and they could choose any idea from one of the plays to creatively adapt into a story. And what this teacher did, her name was Flory, what Flory did is she chose one line, essentially, from Julius Caesar as the inspiration for a reflection on her father's life. I think her father had recently passed away. And so you'll see in her piece how she incorporated family photos and reflections on her father's life and connecting that to the line from Julius Caesar.
We did not always stay dry in the rain. Vacations were camping adventures with 5 children crowded into our blue Volkswagen bus. Our tents leaked. We huddled till the sun came out. We drew in the dirt, caught lightning bugs, and scratched mosquito bites. We raked leaves for no pay. We learned nobility is not about birth or winning in war. It's not about an emotionless stoicism, though it is about strength. The noble do not whine. It's about singing hymns boldly, regardless of key, and whistling in the garden. It's about reading stories at bedtime and doing all the voices. Teaching 3rd grade Sunday school for 35 years because that's the grade you skipped. Going to walk after dinner, taking flowers to neighbors, splashing in the waves, teaching a generation how to catch a crab or make the perfect tomato sandwich. Rule number 1, first peel the tomato. It's about saying the blessing with true thanks and adoring your wife. It's about walking and climbing steps, no matter how hard it gets, and offering your chair even to those who are decades younger. You were a gardener, tending plants, family, and community. This was the noblest Roman of them all. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man.
In both of those examples, you see quite different kinds of approaches to the creation of the story, but there are also some common features, and so we'll talk about some of those as well. The work that we're doing in this institute is based in large part on the model that has been provided by what used to be called the Center for Digital Storytelling, now called Story Center in Berkeley, California. And they are credited in many ways with the movement of digital storytelling around the world, but specifically in the US. And I'm going to talk a little bit in the next slide about how our project is similar and different from the project that they create. But I do think that the stories that are available to you in the library on their website might be helpful in thinking more about the kind of work that we're doing here. Even though our work diverges slightly from the work that they do, in other ways it is a clear reflection of the process that they have developed for this kind of work. So storycenter.org is a good place to go and find more examples of stories. So I said our stories differ somewhat from their model. Let me talk a little bit about their model, and then I'll talk a little bit about how what we're doing is different. Their model is generative in that it almost always begins with the people in a workshop starting in a story circle, and everyone in the circle shares a story. It's a personal story. And the goal of that conversation is to find the kernel of an idea that could become an interesting script and then ultimately a compelling digital story. And their stories are autobiographical. That is really what they're most well known for doing. So the stories are autobiographical and also self-reflective. We're going to definitely play with some of what they do in their model. We are going to have a story circle, for example, later in the process, but our circle is going to be more focused on revision and feedback than on generation. But that work that they do where they have a story and people talk with each other, where they have a circle and people talk with each other, you're going to see how we adapt that for our work together. How our work differs from theirs, however, is that even if you choose a personal narrative, and that is a completely reasonable choice for the work that we're doing, in our case, your scripting would still need to include aspects of research. So you're not just reflecting on your own life, you're thinking about personal connections perhaps to some of the plays or some of the ideas in the plays, and thinking about what you can do in terms of digging deeper to understand that connection. So if you have a particular interest in one of the plays or one of the scenes or a line, your research work is going to be on figuring out what else you can find out about that interest that would inform the story that you ultimately write. So that's where our work diverges slightly from their model. Even if we're doing autobiographical work or personal narrative work, we're framing that work with research. And finally, of course, our projects are connected to very specific texts. So the plays that we're reading and the folk and fairy tales that we're reading as well, your project is going to come out of your interaction with those texts. So it's going to be somehow about your experiences of reading and discussing the plays. Let me talk just a little bit more about the tools that we're going to be using. I mentioned earlier that PowerPoint is the tool that we're going to be using to make the little film projects. PowerPoint's not designed to be a film editing program, it's designed to be a visual presentation program, but it does have some features such as rehearsed timings that will allow us to create something that reads for most viewers as film-like. And Audacity is the audio editing tool that I'm going to be teaching you, if you don't know it already. It's free. You can download it from the internet. It's been around for a long time. It's open access software. It has constantly been updated and changed, and it's relatively easy to use. So I think you'll be able to pick up the kinds of skills that you need to do the mixing and recording in Audacity for this project. It will do much more than we're going to do with it in our institute together, but it is something that is easy to use, generally speaking, for sound editing, and it's something that would be available to your students should you be interested to have them use it later. You can download it to your computer by visiting audacityteam.org and follow the instructions there. They might be slightly different depending on the kind of computer you're downloading it to. So there might be a version for Mac and a different version for a PC, for example. So you want to pay attention to that, but it's easy to download. And it's helpful for us because though you actually can record a voiceover directly into PowerPoint, and that may be something that you would want your students to do if you want to simplify things, you can do very little editing in PowerPoint in terms of the audio, and you can do more editing with images, but very little with audio. So you want to bring in essentially the final version of your audio track. And so the mixed version that includes both your voiceover and whatever soundtrack, whatever musical soundtrack you choose, those two things are going to be mixed together, and that's what you're going to ultimately bring into your PowerPoint presentation. I thought I'd end with just a few tips for you as you're thinking about this project, and we can certainly talk more about some of these ideas in our small groups and in our other sessions together, but I thought these tips might be helpful to you in moving into the work of our first week together. So here's my first tip: temper your expectations. So I'm going to explain it like this. It's very likely that you're going to create a digital story that you feel very proud of, and that's terrific. When that happens, that's amazing. And I will tell you that having done this with hundreds of people at this point, many aged students from all levels essentially, that's almost always what happens. That the project that people create here, they feel quite connected to and quite proud of. And that's great. Some of you are going to create beautiful projects, and they're going to be exemplary in many ways. However, that's not our primary goal. So we're much more interested in the process, in what you're able to learn about the play, the scene, the idea, the theme, yourself in this work, than we are in the creation of an extraordinary film-like project at the end. You are, of course, welcome to continue editing and revising and playing with your piece up until the last minute when it's due, essentially. And that process for you, that creative process for you, may feel incredibly engaging and incredibly involved. And that's great. That is one of the things that often happens for people when they are doing a digital story. But I am offering you up front this idea that it's not necessary that you create a perfect project for the end result. It's much more necessary that you develop a set of skills that are useful to you, but also a deeper sense of your understanding of the idea that you're working with. The second thing is kind of related, and it's fair to expect some frustrations. That we're working with tech tools. We are doing it virtually, which is certainly not ideal, but I think we're going to make it work. And just the realities of working with tech is there are always setbacks. And so that's going to happen for some of you. There will be some challenges. Some things will be harder for you depending on your own level of ability that you're coming in with. We're here to support you, and we're going to help you get to the end product. And I think that you're going to enjoy the process, or that's what I'm hoping at least. But there will probably be some frustration, so I'm just stating that clearly up front so that you'll know that that's to be expected. But I'm also suggesting that you persevere. And as we work together, maybe I'll share a couple of stories of students that I've worked with who encountered some quite real setbacks, and then what they did. Then, also connected to this is the idea of asking questions. So if you find that you're not quite understanding something, or you're struggling with something, or you just don't quite get it, or you need some clarity, just ask us about that. We are all here to support you, and we're happy to talk with you. We can set individual meetings. We can get you connected to some of the other people in the Institute if they're having more success with certain aspects of the work. So we encourage you to ask us questions. The fourth thing you see here is I'm going to suggest that you challenge yourself creatively and that you try something unexpected. So that could be interpreted in any number of ways for you, and I think that each of you individually will have to decide what that means. But this is an opportunity to step outside what may feel like a comfortable space. For example, if you're quite good at historical research, for example, then this is an opportunity to maybe try something else. Maybe if performance is not your thing, here's an opportunity for you to think about the idea of performance. So you can decide what the challenge for yourself is creatively, but I am offering you this suggestion that you push yourself a bit in that regard. And then finally, my suggestion is to be patient with yourself and with your colleagues and with this process. I think you all understand that this Institute is an adapted version of what we originally planned. When we were designing this several years ago, at this point, 3 years ago now, I think, was our the beginning of this design process. We actually were thinking of it as an in-person experience where we would be in a computer lab with lots of access to tools and other folks who could assist us with some of the technical aspects of it. The reality of the world does not allow that, and we have, I think, adapted the work in a way that will be successful for you and for us. But I will just say out loud that we're all learning how to do this together, especially virtually, and so we may all have to have a bit of patience with ourselves. There will be a few moments where you may experience, as I said, some frustrations, and in those moments it might be helpful just to take a breath and realize that we're interested in process, not necessarily in product. All right, that's it for this little video. We will look forward to seeing you tomorrow.